Good morning, everybody. My name is Laura. I'm an American living in Russia, and today's story time is a big one. So, the biggest question I ever get asked is why did I come to Russia, and more specifically, why Krasnodar? I mean, it's almost understandable why you would go to Moscow, but why Krasnodar? I have answered this question 1,000 ways and 1,000 times since I moved here 16 years ago, But the true answer, I've only really started explaining publicly last year when I was on STS's TV show, Мы и они. I'm actually very, very proud of that moment. It was the first time I had been filmed answering the question in all earnest, and we did it in a river, in a beautiful setting, in a beautiful place with people who I cared about and trusted. And I told my story, but it was only a small part of the full story, and I didn't get to have all that I wanted to say in that video. So today, I'm going to give you the absolute, full, and total truth. I was living in South Carolina in a town called Spartanburg. Spartanburg is a very small place. It's one of the smallest places I've ever lived. And there was a large community of Russian speakers. And there's reasons for that. We had the North American BMW plant that was built there in the 90s when a lot of people came over because of perestroika, and they came on religious refugee status. So there was actually 11 Slavic churches in this area and a rather large amount of Russian-speaking immigrants from all of the countries of the Soviet Union. Let me back up a bit. When I was younger, my family moved to England when I was 6 years old. And that left an impression on me of being somewhere absolutely other than the land I grew up in. I grew up in California up at that point, and then to come to London in the middle of a very urban, densely populated city, and it was gray, and they spoke my language, but they spoke it in a funny way, and everything felt other. And I was like, this is magical, this is interesting, this is amazing. And it built in me a bug that I wanted to live somewhere other when I got older. So that's a little background about me. Back to the story about South Carolina. At some point we moved to South Carolina. I met the Russian speakers, and I was intrigued, fascinated, interested, compelled by this community, by the language, by the other. I made friends with a group of them, and in that group was a big, scary, very Russian, very charming man, and his name was Stas. And I fell in love, not just with Stas, but the whole concept of the culture. I spent so much time with these Russians, and they were mostly men, and I would make them food, and I was taught by them how to make first the typical Russian summer salad, and then borscht, and how to cover a table, how to host, and we had great fun, me and my first Russian friends. All the while, my relationship with Stas was developing, and I was embedded in the culture. I was listening to their music. Now, most of these guys had moved to America in the late 90s, so they were kind of stuck in that time frame. So they loved Bratva, they loved Boomer. Everybody's like ringtones was from Boomer. We played Durak until 6 o'clock in the morning. They taught me a card game, Tisuchi, which I'm very good at, by the way. And that was my introduction into Russian culture. And I loved it. And I loved Stas. Stas always dreamed about moving back to his homeland of Krasnodar. For me, and I'm telling you this honestly after, God, what was that? I have to do the math here. So that was 2005 or 2006 when we met, and when I started to become embedded in part of the Russian culture. Stas had always dreamed about going back to Krasnodar, where he grew up. He talked about it a lot, and for me, I was enamored with the idea of an adventurous life. I had told you in one of my shorts that my flavor of crazy is I see an adventure and I jump on it. So I was in love with the adventure. I was in love with Stas. We got married after about 6 months of dating, and I was ready for my big adventure. And that's why I came to Krasnodar. Now, that's not a terrible story. Why would I hide that story? Because there was something much more sinister at play. I did not know this in the beginning. Maybe there were signs. Maybe I lied to myself. But Stas was a psychopath. He was a pathological liar. He was an alcoholic. He was a violent alcoholic, and he was absolutely devoid of empathy, which is very weird considering how important empathy is to me. I think I was blindsided by the fact that I couldn't conceive of someone so evil, so I didn't see it when I was there next to it. Or honestly, the big truth is that I didn't want to see it because I was on the edge of an adventure and I didn't want to stop. I'm telling you this because I now live without shame, and I understand that my steps in my past, whether they're good, bad, or different, probably match someone else's steps, and someone else might hear themselves in my story. So that is why I'm going to tell you the fullness of this story. Stas was a terrible man. His own mother knew and tried to warn me, but I didn't want to hear it. I was put in a lot of really bad situations because of him, and I stayed. And finally, the dream came true that he moved back to Russia, and I was left in America. All the while, I was waiting for him to gather together my documents so that I could join him. I spent 8 months in America waiting for him to get his stuff together so that I could come. Those 8 months were a particularly interesting time for me, knowing that I had made the decision to leave America, but hadn't quite entered Russia, and trying to understand what kind of life I had signed myself up for. In my mind, I knew he was a terrible man, and yet I was going to follow him across the world to a place where I had no protection, a place I didn't understand. I barely spoke Russian at that point, very little Russian. I stayed with his parents while I was waiting. They tried to prepare me a little bit, especially what the expectation of a Russian wife would be, to at least do my best when I got there. And finally, my invitation had been sent. My ticket had been bought. I left for Russia on June 3rd, 2009. I arrived in Russia on June 6th, 2009. That is the nature of traveling to and from Russia. You have to travel through time to get there. Almost immediately after I came to Russia, his true psychopathic nature came out in full earnest. We moved from crap apartment to even crappier apartment to the worst, where I was kept away from everything. This was a time where internet was not widely available, and we certainly didn't have it. I had come from a land in America where I was used to comfortable living, where we had air conditioners and washing machines and dishwashers and clean drinking water out of the tap, to living in the village on the outskirts of Krasnodar, where barely had hot water, no washing machine, no air conditioner, and it gets really hot here. No internet, no way to contact my parents, no friends, no way to travel because I didn't understand how to use the buses and he didn't want me to know. And a man who drank the last of our money. He was violent and unpredictable. And I was there with him, stuck in this village. Now, I say this without any emotion on my face because I have had a very long time to come to terms with what was going on with me at that point. Why did I put myself in such a situation? I am eternally optimistic and unfortunately see the best in people when there's only just a tiny little speck of it deep within all the garbage. And that's what I will focus on. That is my fault. And I had been with this man long enough that he had broken me down to the point where I couldn't really conceive of anything beyond this. And I had for a very long time blamed myself or thought if I just did this, if I just did that, things would be better. This should sound familiar to a lot of women who have found themselves in abusive relationships. It doesn't ever start that way. It's the frog that boils. It's slowly, it gets hotter and hotter. And by the point you realize that you are in boiling water, you've almost gotten used to it. And I had kind of gotten used to it. I was living in the village with this very terrible man. I was in Russia. I was living the dream of coming to a foreign place where I feel like a complete foreigner in the worst of circumstances. And yet I still loved Russia. How is that even possible? I mean, to this day, I love asking myself, where was my mind at that moment? What was the thing that gave me joy in such a terrible place? And it was because I was in somewhere that every place I looked felt other. And one particular moment, as I looked at the curbs of the streets, even just this tiny little piece of asphalt and then a curb, didn't look American. Even something so small as that. Everywhere I looked, the way the people dressed, act, what they ate, the smells, the trees, the fruits, the way that they eat fruit off the trees, all of it was just spectacularly different. And I felt like an explorer, especially in such a place that had been cut off from me as an American, where we were told this was our great enemy, and that we should be grateful that we were born in America and not Soviet Union. And I felt like I was lucky enough to cross that border and actually get to see for myself this life over here, and to find the truth about what is human and what is culture and all those questions that I continue to talk about in all of my videos. It was amazing. I was an explorer of people, and I loved it so much that I stayed in this terrible place. Now, what happened is that I am very outwardly loud and happy and love to connect with people. So even in this small village where the only people I had are the alcoholics next door, the cows outside, and the grandmothers at the post office, I found connection. And I, little by little, picked up some more words, and I was brave enough to get on that bus and find my way into the city with only a few hundred rubles in my pocket. That was just enough for the bus and maybe a drink, like a lemonade at a cafe where I could sit and get free Wi-Fi on my phone so I could reach out to the outside world. And I did that. And I felt entirely lost. Can you imagine trying to navigate through a country that you don't speak the language, and there's no like Yandex maps to help you? You could pull up a map, I think, back in the time, but it was you had to rely on speaking to strangers to help you navigate your way around, to navigate myself onto the correct bus that would take me for an hour and a half to the correct direction to get back to home. I remember one time I was dropped off at the depot in the middle of the night while I had a fever and I had to find my way home, and I didn't have enough money for a taxi, and I did it. And those types of moments where I had to find within myself the strength and wherewithal to survive are some of my most favorite moments of Russia. So what happened was, just going out into the world a little bit, people found me because they saw this American who was speaking English, who was utterly lost and so naive, that people reached out to me and wanted to know more about me, and they wanted me to teach them English. And very quickly I found friendship, and I found Americans here. And I went to my first English speaking club, and I met my very first friends. This includes Masha, who I made a video about one of my great coincidences. This is how I met one of my dearest friends for my whole life, and his name is Syoma. And he was my first true client as a teacher, and he taught me how to teach. And we talked all the time, and we would talk well after the lessons, and he introduced me to my greater circle of friends, and it became silly at some point that he was my client. I just said, I'm firing you as my student. You are now my best friend. So it was him I called when I said I need to leave. He helped me pack up what I could. He took me away and took me to my other new very good friend's house, where I stayed for a couple of weeks until I could make enough money on my own teaching English to afford my first apartment to rent. And that's what we did. That was 15 years ago. Syoma is still deep in my heart as one of my longest and best friends. The person whose house I stayed at, I haven't asked him if he was okay with me mentioning his name, but he knows who he is. Still one of my deepest and longest, oldest friends. The type of friendships that I have built from here through these hard times to where I am now. I would not give up the successes of my life for anything. And I consider those times to be my successes, to be on the streets of Russia. I remember when it was raining and you have to jump through the puddles to get where you're going and try not to get yourself disgustingly wet. And only having just enough money to put a little bit of food in my mouth and enough money to get home. And that's all I had. And I made my life. I learned how to survive, and I built the best friendships because of that. So why did I come to Russia? Because I was looking for an adventure. And I latched on to the first chance I had. And I put myself through great drama to get here, because it was so important to me to live that adventure. I have learned to forgive myself for putting myself in such a bad situation. And I love myself through all of that. As for him, I think the world is better without people like him. But I do not hold hatred in my heart. I do not hold any malice, but I do continuously look out for people like him because they exist. And my problem was I was too naive to imagine that type of evil exists in this world, because he is evil. And there are others like him. Most people are great. 99% of the world is good and has good intentions, but there is that 1%. And for some reason, I tend to find them very quickly. And yet I choose happiness. I choose love. I choose to see this country and all my experiences in it as something joyful. And that's why I still live here. I have made it my own. When I say that Krasnodar is my city, this is what I mean. I made it mine. This city welcomed me and gave me a new life, and one I'm quite proud of. Why did I come to Krasnodar? Why do I stay in Krasnodar? I hope that answers your question. It hasn't been so easy. If you want to know more about me, I am everywhere on social media. You can find me everywhere with Laura Pickens. If you want to interact with me directly, you can join me in my private Telegram channel. The link is in the description. I am so glad to have shared this story with you, and I'll come back next week with another one. Goodbye.